a draw. I'll go to Senator Back and to you next, Senator.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. Isn't it amazing how outrage can be confected out of absolutely nothing? But, Acting Deputy President, I intend to commence my contribution by advising people in this place and those who might be listening what the history of this sad saga is. And if those who are in the chamber now, through you, were listening to this situation, you'd think, well, here's a scenario where a group of Western Australians thought they could grab a few dollars to the exclusion of the wider taxpayer of Australia. How unfair is that? And why the billy-o should that be happening? And we get the Senator Wongs and the Senator McKims of this world coming in with this affected outrage. Well, Acting Deputy President, let me tell you, since I was in business in Western Australia in the 1980s and through to the time I came into this chamber, the period from about 1987 to about 1993 was characterised by a Labor government led initially by a Mr Brian Burke, and when he got out when the temperature became too hot, Mr Peter Dowding and then Ms Carmen Lawrence was left holding the baby. And for those of you who aren't Western Australians, you might just vaguely remember a term that was used. It was called WA Inc. WA Inc. represented the worst corruption. It represented the worst features of any interaction between government and industry and business and communities, and that was the WA Inc. era led by Mr Brian Burke and his cronies. And his cronies being the late Mr Laurie Connell, the late Mr Alan Bond, people who, for example, on the one hand, when it came to a project, the diamond mine in the north of WA, on the one hand were helping the vendor in selling assets to the Western Australian government through Mr Burke, and on the other hand, with the other hand out, were acting supposedly for the people of Western Australia, getting a commission on the way in and on the way out. So we come to 1988. At the time, the late Mr Robert Holmes-a-Court, a corporate raider, a very, very successful businessman, a very successful lawyer, owned the majority of the Bell Group, Bell Resources. And who comes on the scene wanting to buy the Bell Group but Mr Alan Bond? And so for an inflated price, Bond Group take over the Bell Group. This is in 1990 this happened, and of course by 1990 the Bell Group, the Bond Group, was in significant financial difficulty. So to whom did they turn? Their mates. They turned to their best mates. Mr Laurie Connell had a company which had been a shirt manufacturing business in Queensland, became supposedly his bank, an investment bank, Rothwell's. If anybody in the chamber or listening might remember Rothwell's, it was a men's shirt company in the 1960s. Mr Connell turns it into an investment bank which became his personal bank. Time doesn't permit me, in the 24 hours I might have, to tell you the events that took place surrounding it. But I now come to 1991, when Bell is insolvent. And to whom does Bond and his mates turn? Berkey, the architect of WA Inc. You may have listened in this chamber today to all this confected outrage by Senator Wong and by Senator McKim, but until you start to understand the history of this whole event, you won't come to a comprehension of the events. You've heard besmirched Michael Mission, our Attorney-General in Western Australia. You've heard besmirched Dr Mike Nahan, the Treasurer of our state. There's even an attempt to draw Christian Porter into this, along with the Attorney-General, for cheap political gain. But understand the background to this, because what do you think Berkey did? Mr Acting Deputy President, you were probably a kid in school in Perth when all this was happening. My good colleague Senator Siewert, like me, was possibly an agricultural scientist in the service of the Department of Agriculture at that time. I was in business in Western Australia, and how ashamed do you think we all were of the rotten Western Australian Labor government? And the possibility that Burke was being talked about as a future federal Labor politician, dare I say it, even the Prime Minister of this country. Burke got rewarded by going to be the ambassador to the Holy See and Ireland, and got into strife again for the importation of vehicles and also for a stamp collection that he couldn't remember whether it was Burke personal assets or the property of the Labor Party or the poor old taxpayer of WA. So Mr Burke enjoyed some hospitality at Her Majesty's pleasure during that period. So basically, Acting Deputy President, a liquidator was appointed, and probably the only accurate thing Senator McKim did say was that there were some private sector creditors associated with the liquidation of Bell. There was the Australian Tax Office, in other words, the Australian taxpayer, but let me tell you who carried the can, and that's the point of the contribution I wish to make before I get on to the disgraceful statements from Senator McKim about Western Australia's share of GST. I'll tell you who carried the can, Acting Deputy President. You were too young. So what did the Burke WA Inc. rotten WA Labor government do? They funded the litigation through a levy on compulsory third-party vehicle insurance. People like me, my family, pensioners, older people, we were all levied to the tune of $50 per vehicle per year in what became known as the rotten WA Inc. levy. Let's not forget that in all this proud moment of Senator Wong and Senator McKim getting up here, carrying on in some unctuous way. From 1993 onwards, Acting Deputy President, the people of Western Australia funded the litigation that became a case between 1993 and 2003 and 2006 before Justice Owen, 404 sitting days. Just let me remind you, Bell goes to the wall in 1991. The case comes before Justice Owen, sitting as a judge alone, so excellent was that man's commercial knowledge, between 2003 and 2006. And this is the point I want everybody to understand in this place. When the WA government approached the federal government with a view to the federal government contributing to the cost of the litigation, Acting Deputy President, how much did the federal government offer to contribute? Not 1 cent, not a penny, not one, nothing. So it got funded by the Western Australian community. Every time we paid our insurance on our vehicle registration, we paid another $50 to the rotten Western Australian Labor government-funded WA Insurance Commission. And when I sit in here now, and when I listen to the nonsense that I've heard here this morning about the poor old Australian Tax Office, I'll tell you how much the Tax Office put into it. Nothing. Why? Why didn't they? Well, I'll lay a shade of odds, Acting Deputy President, not being a gambling man. I'll lay a shade of odds. They reckon they couldn't win. They reckon they couldn't win. So it left itself to us. Not Brian Burke, not Peter Dowding. It was the Western Australian community of motor vehicle owners who paid the lot. And I'll tell you how much it was between those years. It was in excess of $200 million in 2000 dollars that the Western Australian community paid. More than 200 million. The total cost of litigation would appear to have exceeded about 500 million because the banks, the Commonwealth, Westpac, NAB, they of course were the defendants. And after 404 days, Justice Owen found in favour of the Western Australian government, found in favour of the creditors, the only one of whom had paid anything towards that were the WA community. And Acting Deputy President, let me tell you a little bit about how this legal case was run. It wasn't just your few solicitors down the road in St George's Terrace. All of the legal advice came over from the eastern states of Australia. Every Monday morning they got flown in. Every Friday afternoon they got flown out. Not one or two or 10, but hundreds, funded by us. There were rooms in the high-rise building in Perth that were secured and nobody was allowed into them. Even the cleaning contractor was excluded from going into that section. That's how important they regarded this as being. Why did that happen, Acting Deputy President? Because most of the legal firms in Perth were potentially conflicted as a result of all the actions that had gone on, prosecution, litigation, associated with WA Inc. So can you imagine, anybody that's ever been before a lawyer, can you imagine what the hourly cost of flying lawyers, solicitors, barristers in from the east was every week for that number of years? It was massive. And yep, we got a judgment in our favour. Fantastic, wasn't it? Absolutely fantastic. Money there. And do you know what the amount was going to be, Acting Deputy President? In the order of about $2 billion. I don't reckon that was a bad return. Put in 200 million, might get up to 2 billion, 10 to 1. Go to the track on Saturday, 10 to 1's not a bad gamble. But no. What do you think the banks did? They appealed. They appealed. And on and on and on goes the appeal. How much at this stage do you think the Commonwealth Government was going to contribute to legal costs associated with attacking and defending the appeal? Acting Deputy President, my right hand's too tired now, it's too sore, so I won't have another go. But I will leave it to those in the gallery to tell me how much the Commonwealth was then willing to contribute. Nothing. Not a bad deal for the Commonwealth, is it? They're due for 300 million. Those mugs in the West, they've all paid the costs. We look like we've got a judgment. The banks are appealing it. So do you think the ATO might throw a few bickies in this time? No. So where do we get to? We get to 2015. And now Treasurer Nahan, watching the fact that the money is just going down the gurgler in legal fees, what would you have done, Mr. Acting Deputy President? You're a person with a high degree of commercial knowledge. When you were up against the three big banks and the bickies are dwindling away, I'll tell you what you would have done. You would have used every mechanism at your disposal to try and bring this event to a conclusion on behalf of your community of people who are paying for it. And so that's what brought in the legislation in 2015 by Treasurer Nahan to try and bring this whole sad, sordid mess, which had its genesis in the Burke Labor WA Inc. era, to a close, so that there might be a few shekels left to be shared. Now, I'm not a party to any conversations or communication between Michael Mission, Mike Nahan, Joe Hockey, the Queen of England, Freddie the racehorse, or anybody else. What I'm saying to you is that it appears to me that this was a very, very sensible course of action to try and bring this to a conclusion before there was nothing left in the Bicky barrel, in which case there wouldn't be anything for any of the creditors. Now, these people over here can carry on as they like about the action of the Attorney-General. He made it very clear in this statement today in terms of actions taken by whom and when and who knew what. Now, I'm going to finish my contribution by addressing myself to the slur that was visited upon Western Australians by Senator McKim. Yes, it's true, Acting Deputy President. Western Australia today is getting back 30 cents of every GST dollar that we generate. 30 cents in the dollar. Those in the Northern Territory are getting 530 cents per dollar. That's $13,000 for every person. Tasmanians, represented by Senator McKim, don't know why he complains so much. He's not on a bad deal. Tasmanians per capita out of the GST share, you get $4,444 per person. That is, you get almost $1.80 for every dollar you contribute. It goes down from there. South Australians get just under $4,000. Queenslanders get just under $3,000. The ACT, it gets almost $3,000. Senator Seselja will be pleased to learn you get 115 cents. Victoria and New South Wales get just under $1 for dollar. They get $2,278. Remember that figure of $13,200 per head that Tasmanians get? I hope Senator McKim's listening. He won't be. Western Australians get $760 for generating 48% of the nation's export wealth. We are getting $760 a head, contrasted with those in the Territory getting $13,200. And the deepest insult that Senator McKim has visited upon us is the fact that Western Australia was a recipient state for many years. Well, yes, we were. And through you, Acting Deputy President, I'll tell you why. Because right through those years when manufacturing in the Rust Belt states of Victoria and New South Wales were active, there was a very high level of tariff protection on manufacturing. And why was Western Australia, and to some extent South Australia, a recipient? Because we were agricultural economies, not manufacturing. And yes, Senator McKim's right when he says that Western Australia was a recipient state, but not for the purposes of a handout, not for the purposes of a subsidy. We were a recipient state to try and balance the high levels of tariff protection that those states enjoyed. And I will conclude with this comment that it's hardly a federation when one member of the family gets 30 cents in the dollar for the contribution it makes and other members of the family are getting $4 to $5. And how does it play out? I'll tell you how it plays out. There's only one state in Australia this year that will declare a deficit. Every other state will declare a surplus. WA's deficit is $3.9 billion. Do you know why that's important? Because if we were getting dollar for dollar, we would be getting $4.2 billion. We also would be in surplus, but the others wouldn't. I'll tell you about what happened in WA Inc. It's a long story, and today is only its final chapter.
Thank you, Senator Back. Senator